Authenticity is one of those things that when I say the word, you know what it means. When you see it in real life, you recognize something as being authentic, but it's pretty difficult to put a pin in exactly what it means to be authentic. Well, that's exactly what Charles Taylor, one of the most influential philosophers of the late 20th century, tries to get to the bottom of in The Ethics of Authenticity. It's just not as easy of a question as you might originally think, and Taylor recognizes that. But he also wraps the discussion in a sort of diagnosis of some of the things that he saw as wrong in current society in the 90s. And one of the things that I found most interesting about the book is how some of the things that he pointed out have extrapolated now 30 years later. There is a lot to talk about here, and while I'm far from an expert on philosophy, I'm going to try to break down the key points that stood out to me while reading and hopefully take you along on the understanding of authenticity that I'm trying to build for myself. So grab a tea, grab a coffee, and let's have a chat. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name's Christian. I'm a CPA and senior financial analyst. The Ethics of Authenticity is one of the first books on my current learning plan that I'm working through on sort of a mix between meaning and the philosophy of technology. The book is a bit weird. It's framed as a diagnosis of what Taylor calls the three malaise of current society. But he basically says, I don't have enough time to talk about the last two, so I'm just going to focus on the first one, and then I'll say a little bit about the last two later. The book is really about Taylor's dissection of how individualism and authenticity have been corrupted in our modern society, and his process of trying to understand what authenticity is. So the first point he raises is what I think can be considered the seductive lie of just being yourself. Just be yourself is one of those things that I think we hear a lot, especially growing up, and something that is told to adolescents and young people when they're trying to figure out who they are, who their influences are, who they look up to, and how to move past some of the insecurities that they begin to feel as they become fully conscious individuals. The sort of cultural message is to look inwards, trust yourself, and to create your own values and go through life with those. This is a very liberating concept, but you have to ask, who am I to know what is valuable? Personally, I am a 29-year-old accountant. Do I really have the experience and the judgment required to define how life should be lived or the ideals that we should strive for? And not only what ideals are important, but what is the hierarchy? In moments of conflict between two different ideals, which one should you align your behavior towards? It's hard. And I think the difficulty here is that both sides are true. We are free to create our own value structure and act according to it. But at the same time, this is extremely difficult to do. And I don't think most people are able or even want to put in the time required to do so. The point Taylor ultimately raises is that we can't just be subjective. And what he says is that the issue with this moral subjectivism is that when you have a society where beliefs are selected based on feeling, nothing can be debated. You can't have a real conversation about what might be right or wrong because it's just your opinion. How can I argue against your opinion? You don't get the benefits that come with people being able to challenge your beliefs. And what he points out is it actually ironically creates new forms of conformity because people aren't willing or aren't able to create their own properly thought through value structures, so they just defer it to someone else. And this is where I find it interesting because this book was written in the 90s, way before social media, but now in 2025 you have these influencers online which have millions and millions of followers and are trusted in a big way to tell people how they should live their lives. So it's like this problem that's been identified has just been exacerbated 10 times over. I think a good example of this issue on social media is productivity culture and the domination of what Taylor would call instrumental reasoning, which is the idea that without moral frameworks to guide our thinking, we just defer to essentially cost-benefit analyses on everything. How do we maximize efficiency? How do we get the most output for the least input? How do we spend our time best to get the most work done? Which I don't really have anything against, but I think that people are flooded with the message that You have to always be maximizing the efficiency of your time in whatever way you can. The other place I think you see it is in the self-care space, where it's really just narcissism disguised as self-care, like these elaborate morning routines or an excessive focus on fitness and sharing your progress online. It's not really about any of those. It's just about you and indulgence in yourself. And I just think when I look at these things, Taylor has a point. It's a shift from real or authentic self-care towards being seen as a person who does self-care. So the question that gets raised is, if the meaning of just be yourself leads to moral subjectivism and leads to these outcomes, what is the alternative? And here Taylor says that we're missing 3 key ingredients. The first key point that Taylor raises is that authentic living requires what he calls a horizon of significance. You can't be true to yourself in a vacuum. We don't create meaning from scratch. We inherit frameworks that we build off and act off to be ourselves. In other words, living authentically isn't just being yourself. It's acting authentically in relation to everything else in the world around us. Other people, our history, our culture, these things are not decided by us. They are forced on us by the universe when we come into it, and they provide what he calls a horizon of significance to which we can live authentically in front of. So I think that's a little bit complicated, but to give an example, try to describe yourself as you might do if we met in person. Maybe you're a mother or a father, or a student, or a CPA, or an athlete, or an engineer. Why are you using those words? You're using them because within our culture, they have meaning and they have value. If you instead described yourself as the only person with 3,462 hairs on the top of your head, it means nothing unless you are living in a culture where 3,462 has some sort of religious significance or something like that. The problem is that when we neglect our culture and our history and our traditions, and we try to assign value to things without it, the only way for us to do that is to think with instrumental reason. It's to view it from the perspective of, how useful is this thing to me? And it's a bit of a vicious cycle, because as we shift focus to individualism, we lose our connection to our history and our culture and our traditions, etc. So the second question you have to ask is, how do we get this back? If we require a background of context to live authentically, it follows that living authentically comes through engagement with the world. You gotta get out of the office, away from the computer, and you got to touch some grass. Taylor calls this dialogue, which isn't just verbal communication, but just simply interaction with the world. And he lays out 3 different types of dialogue that are important to live authentically. The first is dialogue to establish value. Debate and discussion help us refine what matters. And without dialogue with others and the debate of your ideas and the things that you value, those values are simply arbitrary preferences. You have to weigh them against someone else's thoughts or against some third thing that you can compare them against. That's how we discover what we need to strive towards. The second is dialogue for recognition. The way Taylor puts it is that self-fulfillment is not entirely subjective. Almost all of the things that people say they value, when you ask them to define what matters to them, are things that require recognition from others. For example, friends and family require a mutual care for each other. Success in your career or your business requires recognition from your colleagues or superiors or customers that what you're doing is valuable. Almost no matter what you choose, you can't escape it. And the person that rejects all of this external validation is not being authentic. They're disconnected. And then the third form of dialogue that's important for authenticity is dialogue for differentiation. We discover ourselves by comparing ourselves to others. And when we do that, we discover the oddities and the unique abilities and tastes and interests that we have as individuals because other people don't have those same levels of interest or skill. Our personal identity, or at least opportunities to create that identity, come from the things that make us different from from everyone else. So it's a little bit of a paradox. You need the community to understand who you are individually. And then the last thing that Taylor points out that is required to live an authentic life is creation and action. This is the most interesting and important point for me. There's a lot of social media, Hollywood style spiritualism on the internet about finding yourself. And as far as Taylor is concerned, it's pretty much total nonsense. We don't find ourselves like discovering some hidden object from the past. We make ourselves through action and creation. By acting and creating, you discover new ways of being, and then you choose to become that by physically acting in the way that you think is right. And this is by no means a fast process. It requires time. It requires risk. It requires experimentation. You need to just do things and put yourself out there and get feedback and adjust and come back again and give yourself time to achieve things. That is how you become who you are. So I think the key point looking back here is that none of these things are really about me. None of them are about looking inwards and spending time alone to figure out what you think. And definitely none of these are about building a personal brand or refining the perfect morning routine or retreating from the stresses and the challenges of the world. It's all about engagement. It's about dialogue and discovering the things that matter and refining it by pushing it up against the world around you. By doing that, you can finally live in line with those things that you figure out are meaningful. And that is living an authentic life. This book gave me a lot to think about and has taken a lot of time for me to digest and process and get to a point where I'm able to share it in a somewhat meaningful way. I highly recommend actually reading the book yourself. It was a very mind-opening book for someone who's not an expert in the world of philosophy, but is passionate about this type of thing. So if that sounded interesting to you, please read it. There's a lot more in it than what I've talked about. If you like that video, you might like this video over here, which is another book club video about a book I read this summer called At the Existentialist Cafe, which is about some of the leading existential philosophers of the 20th century. It is an awesome book. I recommend that video, but if you don't watch it, thank you for watching this one and have a wonderful day.